I have driven for the Duke of Northborough for 11 years, through every weather this northern country can produce, sleet that freezes the reins to your fingers, fog so thick you navigate by the sound of the road, summers that last 3 weeks and winters that last 6 months and do not apologize for either. I have driven his father before him. God rest that difficult man, and his father's horses before those. I know this estate the way I know my own 2 hands. I know every crack in the long south approach, every dip in the moorland track where the carriage leans, every stone post that marks the edge of Northborough land, where the boundary begins, where the first beech tree stands crooked from years of northern wind, where the road lifts over the ridge and the house comes suddenly into view, gray and massive and lit, and the sight of it always does something to my chest that I have never been able to describe accurately. I am telling you this because what I witnessed in the winter of His Grace's 38th year is not the sort of thing a man like me usually speaks of. Stewards keep counsel. Drivers hold their tongues. We move through houses and across roads and down long dark passages, and we see things, and we file them away, and we say nothing. That is the work. That is the professional virtue of the position. But I am old now, and the young ones ask, and I have come to believe, in the way that old men arrive at beliefs they would have dismissed at 40, that truth kept entirely silent has a way of quietly dying, and some truths deserve to outlive the people who witnessed them. And so I am telling you this, plainly and in the order it happened, by someone who was there. His name was Dorian Ashcroft, the 7th Duke of Northborough, and he was, by every account I have ever heard that was not mine, exactly what they said. Cold, hard, the most feared landowner in the 3 northern counties. Men paid their rents on time not because the Duke's bailiff was patient, but because the Duke was not. Merchants settled accounts the moment Northborough sent word. At assembly dinners, they seated him at the head because there was no one willing to argue the point, and he left early enough that no one had to pretend to enjoy his company. He was not cruel, I want to be precise about that, because I watched him closely for 11 years and cruelty is a specific word with a specific meaning, and he did not meet it. He did not take pleasure in harm. He did not diminish people for sport. He had a code, and it was a strict one, and it operated on different terms from the codes of his peers. And those peers found the difference unsettling and called it coldness because coldness was the nearest word they had. He was, and I am looking for the right description, and the right description is this. He was a man who had learned, through a series of losses I will come to, that caring about things aloud was expensive in ways that caring about them privately was not. So he cared about things privately. Deeply and privately, and the world saw the surface and called it ice. He had also, in the autumn of that year, inherited a problem his father had carefully hidden from him until it became inescapable. A binding entailment, written into the original grant of the Northborough title 4 generations ago, which required the sitting duke to be lawfully married before his 39th birthday or forfeit the unentailed portion of the estate, the eastern farms, the river mills, the village properties, a considerable stretch of productive moorland, to a collateral branch of the family. That branch had existed at the edge of the Ashcroft family tree for 4 generations, waiting with great patience, and what I imagine was ill-concealed appetite for exactly this eventuality. The Duke had turned 38 in October. The birthday was in February. He had 4 months, and he had not in 8 years since his father's death seriously entertained the idea of marrying anyone. I learned all of this from the solicitor's letter, which the Duke read at his desk on an October morning while I waited in the passage with dispatches from the home farm. The letter was 4 pages. When he finished, he set it face down on the blotter with a care that was not the care of a man who is calm, but the care of a man who is making himself move slowly on purpose. He sat still for approximately 30 seconds. Then he called for me. "Hadley," he said, "I need you to drive south to Crestholme in a fortnight. There is a man there named Vane, a Mr. Geoffrey Vane, formerly of the merchant class, currently of no class in particular, who has approached my solicitors with a proposal. His daughter, in exchange for a settlement of his debts." I said nothing. I was not paid to say things. "You will bring the carriage," the Duke continued. "You will be civil to the household. You will make it clear that the arrangements are straightforward and will be honored." He paused. He picked up a pen, set it down. "You will bring her back here, and I will honor the terms." "Yes, Your Grace," I said. "She is 23, he said, apparently to the dispatch on the desk. "The solicitor says she is capable, whatever that signifies." I said it probably signified something useful, and I withdrew, and I drove south 12 days later. I had formed a picture of Miss Vane in my mind during the journey down, as one inevitably does. The daughter of a gambling man who had drunk and wagered away a decent fortune, offered to a northern duke as a living settlement. My picture was vague and not generous. A pale girl, I thought, frightened and soft, the sort that would arrive weeping into a handkerchief and continue weeping through the winter, unused to a house this large and a north this cold and an arrangement this bleak. I had prepared myself to be patient with such a creature, because 11 years of service to Dorian Ashcroft had taught me that patience was my primary professional virtue, and that not all of it would be directed at the Duke. Crestholme was a market town of middling size, gray in November, the kind of gray that is not atmospheric but simply overcast. I found the Vane house on its eastern edge, once a good address, now showing the particular dignity and decline of a place whose exterior is kept tidy because the people inside it still have their pride, whatever else they have lost. The paint was clean. The step was swept and the threshold whitened, which is more than most houses on that street were doing. The window boxes held dead plants that had been properly cut back rather than simply left to collapse, because someone in that house believed that even dead things deserved to be dealt with properly. I knocked. A young woman opened the door. She was, I should say immediately, not what I expected. She was perhaps 23, with dark hair that she wore simply, pinned back without ornament, because there was plainly no money for ornament, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. Her eyes were a dark, clear gray, the color of the sky on the road just before the weather arrives, and they had a quality of steady appraisal that I noted at once and did not forget. She was not beautiful in the way the word is used at London assemblies, with its implication of deliberate arrangement and careful display. She was handsome in the way a well-made piece of work is handsome, everything in its right proportion, nothing wasted, nothing added for effect. She wore a plain dress that had been pressed to within an inch of its life. She did not fidget in the doorway. She looked at me directly and calmly, and I had the immediate impression that she looked at everything directly and calmly, as a matter of habit, because looking at things any other way was a form of self-deception she had decided she couldn't afford. "Mr. Hadley," she said, not a question, not a greeting precisely, more an acknowledgement that something expected had arrived on schedule. "Miss Vane," I said, "I'm His Grace's." "His Grace's steward, yes, he rode ahead." She opened the door wider. "Please come in. My father is in the study. I've made tea if you'd like it after the road." She had made tea. I stepped into the parlor, and there was indeed a pot, covered and waiting, with 2 cups already set on a small tray, because she had calculated the approximate hour of my arrival based on the distance from Northborough, and had the tea ready precisely when I was likely to want it. I noticed this and filed it without comment, as one does. It seemed at the time a small and domestic thing. I would come to understand that it was, in fact, almost everything about her character compressed into one small act. The anticipation of what was needed, the quiet arrangement of it, the refusal to wait for someone else to manage. Her father came in from the study. Mr. Geoffrey Vane was a man of 60, once well-made, now soft around the edges in the way that comfortable ruin produces in men who have spent years believing the next scheme will recover the last one. He had a politician's smile, and the eyes of someone accustomed to working out how a room will receive what he says before he says it. He shook my hand warmly. He thanked me for making the journey. He asked after the Duke in the tone of a man carefully not asking how much trouble he was in. He spoke about the settlement terms with the brisk efficiency of someone who would rather move through an uncomfortable topic quickly, as though speed were a substitute for reflection. He did not look at his daughter when he spoke about the terms. She did not look at him. She sat across the parlor with her hands in her lap, perfectly still, watching the window or the middle distance or some interior point that neither of us could access. And I understood, with the clarity of a man who has watched people navigate difficult situations for 11 years, that she had heard this speech before. Not this particular speech, perhaps, but speeches of its type, speeches in which her father described her situation in the language of practicality and mutual advantage. And she had made her peace with the speeches in some private room of herself that her father's easy optimism could not enter. She was not angry, I should say, or if she was, she had transformed it into something more useful, which is what people of real character do with anger. She was composed. She was organized. She had packed her one small trunk, her mother's trunk, worn leather with brass fittings that had been mended twice by someone competent. I saw it in the hallway when I arrived, and I saw it again on the morning of departure, standing by the door, and it struck me that it was not a small trunk for a young woman with 3 weeks to prepare. It was a deliberate small trunk, the trunk of someone who had chosen what to take and had chosen carefully, and what she had chosen was books and mending and 2 dresses, and I later learned. A journal she had kept since she was 14, and a small portrait of her mother, and nothing that was not either useful or irreplaceable. On the morning we left, a girl came to the door, a kitchen girl who had been in the house since before the decline, I gathered, and who wept when Miss Vane embraced her. Miss Vane held the girl and said something quietly into her ear that I did not catch and did not try to catch because it was private, and then she patted the girl's hand, 3 times, firmly, the way you comfort someone when you cannot make the thing better and you know it and you are not going to pretend otherwise, and she turned toward the carriage. Her eyes were dry. She turned them first to the carriage, then to the Duke, who had ridden down from Northborough to accompany the journey back and who was waiting on his black horse, not looking at her, his face in its professional arrangement of nothing in particular. I watched to see if she flinched at him. She did not. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said, in the voice a competent person uses for a new professional arrangement, clear, appropriately respectful, entirely unservile. "Miss Vane," the Duke said, and nothing further, and I handed her up into the carriage, and we set off north into the gray November morning, and the Vane house got smaller behind us, and Miss Vane did not look back. The road from Crestholme to Northborough in early November is 4 days in a well-sprung carriage moving at a sensible pace, and it is not a gentle road. The first day went without event, cold and quiet, Miss Vane reading a small book she had taken from her case, the Duke riding alongside at the distance of a man who has no intention of conversation. I drove. I listened to the road and the horses and the sky, which was the usual thing. The trees thinned as we moved north, and the landscape opened out into the kind of country that does not trouble itself to be welcoming, and the light became very flat and clear, the light that means the season is preparing something. On the second day, the wheel. We were on a stretch of road that cuts across the southern edge of the Aldenmere Moor, open and windswept, the kind of landscape that has no opinion of you and no interest in being otherwise. When the left rear wheel found a rut that had frozen overnight and cracked along its spoke in a way that meant we would not be moving at any pace beyond a slow walk until the wheel was repaired, which required time and dry weather, neither of which I had at that moment. I pulled the horses to a halt and examined the situation with the careful pessimism of someone who has been examining wheel damage in all weathers for 11 years. The damage was repairable. The repair would take most of a day in good conditions. The conditions were deteriorating rapidly, because while I had been examining the wheel, the sky had been making a decision, and the decision involved wind from the west and a dark front moving over the moor that I had seen enough times to know what it carried. I unhitched the near horse and rode ahead. 3 miles up the road was the Aldenmere Arms. I knew it from previous journeys, a posting inn of decent character kept by a woman named Mrs. Fellows who had the specific competence of people who live far from help and have consequently learned to manage all of it. I arranged rooms and sent word back. I returned to find the Duke had dismounted and was walking alongside the carriage rather than riding ahead, which was not a thing he needed to do since I had the situation in hand, and which I noted without comment. Miss Vane came down from the carriage when we reached the inn without any suggestion of difficulty about the situation. She thanked Mrs. Fellows for accommodating them at short notice. She asked about the repair and whether it would be 1 day or 2, and when I said I was uncertain until the weather gave me a clear hour to work, she said she quite understood and that she had brought enough to read, which I believed entirely. There were 2 rooms. I will say again, as I said before, 2 rooms, respectable and plain, one at the top of the stairs and one at the back of the first floor, and I slept in the stable, and the situation was as it always is when road circumstances impose on people who have not asked to be imposed upon. The Duke took the room at the top. Miss Vane took the back room. Nothing about it was otherwise. It was the snow that made it 2 days instead of 1. The snow came properly in the night, not the exploratory flurry of early November, but committed, purposeful snow, 6 inches by morning and still falling, covering the yard and the moorland road beyond and making the repair both impossible and unnecessary until it eased, since a repaired wheel on an uncleared road would last perhaps 3 miles. Mrs. Fellows kept a common table in the evenings. The other guests that first night were a traveling tutor named Mr. Pemberton on his way south from a posting in Unwick, and a wool merchant from Hexham who said very little, ate quickly, and excused himself at the first opportunity. The Duke sat at the end of the table with the expression he reserved for public dining, which was the expression of a man enduring the situation with adequate grace and no particular interest. Miss Vane sat near the middle, which placed her directly opposite the tutor. The tutor was a nervous, well-intentioned man of 30 with a habit of talking when uncomfortable, and he talked about the road and the weather and the difficulty of winter travel, and Miss Vane answered him thoughtfully. And somewhere in the middle of it, the conversation turned to the question of whether the inn's yard would flood if the snow melted quickly in a single day. "The yard sits 3 feet above the drainage channel to the east," she said, as though this were something one simply knew. "So provided the thaw is gradual, the standing water will move off without issue. If it comes quickly, all in a day, say, the lower section of the stable floor would likely go under. Mrs. Fellows would know better than I would, given she's managed the place through several winters. But if the thaw looks sharp, I'd suggest getting anything valuable off the stable floor in advance." The tutor blinked. "You've stayed here before, Miss Vane." "No," she said simply. "But you can read the drainage from the yard. The slope is visible from the east side of the building, and the channel takes the eye once you've noticed it." I glanced at the Duke. He was looking at her with an expression I had not seen on his face in 11 years of watching it. Not quite attention. He was always attentive, in the watchful, contained way that people who are always observing the room around them are attentive. But this was something more considered. He was revising something internally. I could see it the way you can sometimes see a man revise a figure in his head. A slight stillness, and then a slight shift, and then the calculation is different and he continues. Later, after supper, the tutor's boy, a child of about 8 who had been sitting in the corner behind his guardian, a quiet child who had eaten carefully and avoided attracting attention, knocked over his cup. The cup was badly weighted and had been sitting on an uneven section of the table, and it went over with a clatter and a splash, and the boy went the color of new brick and froze in his chair in the way children freeze when they have done something wrong in a room full of adults. Miss Vane had the napkin in her hand before anyone else had reacted. She mopped up the spill with complete efficiency and said, not to the boy exactly, not to anyone exactly, simply into the air of the table in a conversational tone. "These cups are very badly balanced. I've caught mine twice this evening. They want a wider base." Which was not true, I had been watching, but which was said in the tone of someone reporting a fact about cups, and not about an 8-year-old boy's moment of mortification. The boy's shoulders came down from around his ears. The tutor exhaled. The wool merchant didn't look up from his own plate. The Duke watched this. I watched him watch it. He said nothing, and when we rose from the table he crossed to the door and held it, which was not a thing I had witnessed him do in a public house before. Not a performance. There was no one to perform for at that hour with that company. Simply a thing he did. I thought about that door for quite a long time afterward. The second day of the snow was more confined. The yard was white and locked, the road invisible, the moors beyond entirely blank. The inn's common room became the world for that day. I worked on the harness and the wheel parts I could reach and addressed myself to preparations for when the weather cleared. The tutor read to his boy in the corner. The wool merchant departed first thing, on foot to the nearest relay point, bundled in everything he owned. And the Duke and Miss Vane were, by circumstance, in the same public rooms for the entirety of a long, cold, snowbound day, with no duties to retreat to and no exits that weren't full of weather. I was mending a collar strap near the fire in the early afternoon when Miss Vane came in from the passage with her book, and settled into the chair near the window with the ease of someone making use of available light, rather than making a statement about anything. The Duke was in the same room, standing at the other window looking at the yard and apparently thinking, which was how he spent time when he was not doing something specific. He thought very thoroughly, and the thinking looked from outside exactly like standing very still doing nothing, which I had come to read correctly. They were quiet for a while. I was nearly invisible, which is the way of things when one is occupied with a task and doing it without fuss. And after a time, not a short time, the kind of time that has to accumulate before anything real can be said in it, the Duke said, apparently to the window, "What are you reading?" Miss Vane glanced up. She said the title, a Roman text in Latin which the Duke had read in his schooling and she had read in her father's library, which was one of the few things her father's library had still been good for. There was a brief exchange about it, the sort of exchange that begins with a title and becomes, before either party has quite noticed, a real conversation about ideas. What the author understood about governance, whether certain observations held across different centuries, the particular quality of Roman thinking about duty and private feeling and their persistent conflict. It was the only conversation of that kind that I witnessed in entirety, and I include it here because it is part of the picture. What I observed was not two people performing conversation for an audience. There was no audience, only me, and I was a piece of furniture to both of them by that point in the afternoon. What I observed was two people who were genuinely interested in the same problem, talking about it from their different angles, and finding that the angles complemented rather than collided. She had read more widely. He had thought more deeply about fewer things. The conversation moved the way good conversations move, which is that it went somewhere none of its participants planned at the start. She said something about how the problem with duty, as the Romans framed it, was that it assumed the person performing it had been consulted about its terms. He said he thought the Romans were realistic about that. Duty was rarely negotiated. She said she thought realism and resignation were often confused. He looked at her again with that same revising expression and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Yes, I think that's right." I went on with the strap. That evening after supper, from which the tutor and his boy had excused themselves early, the boy asleep on his feet, the common room emptied out, and it was only the Duke and Miss Vane and me in the corner with my harness work. The fire had settled to a steady warmth. Miss Vane was at the small table with her notebook, writing not a letter I later understood, but the journal she had kept for years. The Duke came in from the passage, and he did not see me at first, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her. She looked up. He said, "I am not," and stopped. He had a habit, which I had observed over 11 years, of beginning sentences and reconsidering them in the space between the first word and the rest, and the reconsideration always meant that what he had started to say was something he meant more than he usually permitted himself to mean. "I should have asked," he said, "whether you were willing for this arrangement." Miss Vane looked at him for a long moment with those clear gray eyes. "Would it have changed the arrangement?" she said, not unkindly, not as a reproach, simply as a real question because she wanted to know the real answer. "No," he said after a pause that was honest rather than evasive. "Not in the immediate sense, the terms were set." "Then asking would have been a form of theater," she said. "And I don't think you are a theatrical man, Your Grace." He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, not quite surprise and not quite amusement, but something that occupied the territory between them, as though she had produced a sentence he had not expected, and he was holding it up to examine it. "No," he agreed. "I was not unwilling," she said, returning to her notebook. "I want to be precise. I was not consulted, and that is a different thing from being unwilling. I have made my peace with the difference." She said it quietly, without accusation, and without performance. She said it the way she said everything, with the precision of someone who has learned that imprecise words cause more trouble than silence, and that silence causes less trouble than most people assume. The Duke stood in the doorway a moment longer, and then he said, "Good night, Miss Vane," and left. I sat by the fire with my harness strap. In 11 years, I had not heard Dorian Ashcroft say good night to anyone. We left the Aldenmere Arms on the third morning, the wheel sound. I had been up at 5 to work in the first clear hour, and the job was clean, and the road frozen but passable, scraped back by Mrs. Fellowes' boys who had been at it since dawn. The remaining 2 days of the journey were different from the first 2. The silence was outwardly the same, but it had changed character, the way a silence between strangers and a silence between people who have acknowledged each other are both silence but are not the same thing at all. Miss Vane read. The Duke rode. But twice during those 2 days, he drew his horse alongside the carriage window, and they exchanged a few words, observations about the road, the landscape, the particular quality of the northern moor as the country around them changed. And she answered him with that same steady directness. And the exchanges ended naturally, without strain, in the way conversations end when neither party is performing one. The moor, as we came north, was extraordinary that November. I have driven it 1,000 times, through 1,000 seasons, and it does not surprise me. I know its shapes and its light changes too well for surprise, But that particular November it had a quality I find difficult to name precisely. The light was very flat and clear, the clarity that comes before deep snow settles for the season, and it made the heather and the bracken and the rock outcroppings look as though they had been standing there since before people thought to name them. Unpeopled and permanent, indifferent to the century. Miss Vane noticed it. I knew she had noticed it because she stopped reading. She put the book down on the seat beside her and turned to look out the window, and she looked for a long time, not with the apprehension of a person confronting wildness for the first time, but with something more like recognition, as though a part of her interior landscape had a shape this country matched. Northborough Hall came into view as the light was going on the fourth day. The long beach drive, the trees still holding the ragged end of their leaves, the house at the end of it massive and gray and lit from within against the darkening sky, and I felt the particular pride I always felt at that sight. The pride of a man who has served a thing for so long it becomes partly his. Miss Vane sat very still when she saw it. The Duke had ridden ahead and was waiting at the main steps, already dismounted, talking to Mrs. Brand, the housekeeper, who had been running the domestic side of Northborough for 20 years with the competence of a general and the face of a woman who has no use for frippery. I helped Miss Vane down from the carriage. She stepped onto Northborough gravel for the first time and looked up at the house for a moment that was longer than a glance but not as long as a study, and then she turned to me. "Thank you for a careful journey, Mr. Hadley," she said. "The roads were not kind." I said it was my honor, and I meant it, and that surprised me mildly. She turned and walked up the steps toward the Duke and Mrs. Brand, and the door opened and she went in, and the door closed behind her and Northborough took her in. The first weeks told me what the road had already begun to tell me, which is that Miss Vane was the sort of person who looks at a new situation directly and learns it from the inside rather than waiting to be shown where to stand. She did not demand a tour. She took herself on one, room by room and floor by floor, methodically and without making a point of it, so that by the end of the first week she knew every occupied room in the main house by function and by the name of whoever tended it. She learned the staff's names before she learned the names of the 4 adjacent families. She thanked people in the specific way, not the general courtesy of condescension from above, but the particular thank you of someone who has noticed exactly what you have done and found it worth the breath to acknowledge. The kitchen girl who had the difficult early shift, the footman who kept the library fire going without being asked, the boy who brought in coal before the weather turned. Mrs. Brand told me at the end of the second week that the housemaids had begun turning out the linen cupboard with more care than previously. I asked why. She said, with the specific composure of a woman who has revised an opinion and is not going to make a production of it, because Miss Vane noticed the mildewed corner and mentioned it to me directly, without making anyone feel accused of anything, and now they are taking an interest in the matter. She paused. She also reorganized the drying configuration in a way that has halved the time it takes to lay the linen out flat. I do not know where she learned that. Possibly from running a household at reduced means for some years, I said. Mrs. Brand gave me the look she gives when I have said something she considers obvious, and is gracious enough not to say so. The Duke, I observed, began coming home for midday dinner. He had not done this before. He had always worked through the middle of the day, eating in the library or not eating at all, the way men with large responsibilities sometimes lose track of the fact that they have bodies with requirements. He began appearing in the dining room at noon. Miss Vane was always already there, not having waited for him. She took her midday meal at noon because noon was the sensible time to take it, and they ate together with the courtesy of people who are discovering, one conversation at a time, that they prefer each other's company to eating alone, but are not quite certain what to do about this discovery. The accounts episode happened in the third week, and I think of it as the moment things shifted properly, not in one direction only, but in both. There was a quarterly household accounting, tallying expenditure against income from the farms and the rents. I managed the outdoor half of it, and a man named Corby, the indoor steward, competent, correct, and somewhat rigid in his assumptions about who might usefully look at figures, managed the domestic accounts. Miss Vane asked on the 15th day of her arrival whether she might examine the household accounts. Not the estate accounts, only the domestic side, the provisions and coal and linen and staffing costs. Corby showed them to her with the particular courtesy of someone who is confident, The inquiry will amount to a pleasant afternoon for the lady, and an unchanged set of books for everyone else. She spent an afternoon with the ledgers. The following morning she came to me. There is a discrepancy in the coal account, she said. It has been running approximately 14% over the delivery estimate for 6 consecutive quarters. That is not seasonal variation. The estimate would have been revised by now if it were weather patterns. Either the supplier is billing for a higher grade than is being delivered, or the delivery weights are being recorded incorrectly at the point of counting. Either way, the delivery records want checking against the actual bills, and someone should weigh a delivery. I looked at the figures she had marked. She had done the calculation correctly, and the flags were right. The Duke, when I brought this to him that afternoon, was quiet for a moment. She identified this, he said. In an afternoon, Your Grace. Another pause. Have Corby check the delivery records against the supplier's invoices and arrange for a counted delivery. Corby checked. A counted delivery was taken. The discrepancy was confirmed. The delivery weights had been shaved, not dramatically but consistently, for a year and a half. The correction was made, the savings were real, and the supplier's representative was brought to a brief and unpleasant interview that I was glad not to have been present for. The Duke thanked Corby formally because Corby had done the verification work. He did not thank Miss Vane, not in any public or named way, because the domestic accounts were her household now, and finding errors in them was not technically remarkable. But that evening at dinner he said, as though it were merely a passing observation, the Western Moorland track is passable on foot at this season if one starts before 10. The light is very clear on the west side before noon. Miss Vane looked at him steadily. Thank you, she said, in the tone of someone who has understood that this is not a comment about walking. She walked the western track the following morning, and came home with a soaked hem and bright eyes, and ate a large breakfast. And Mrs. Brand reported all of this to me with the expression of someone adding a new column to an existing ledger. The social difficulty arrived in the 4th week. I had expected it. In my experience, social difficulties of a particular sort always arrive when a woman of plain origin enters a house of great consequence, arriving, as they always do, in the guise of a social call. Lady Aldwell was the Countess of the neighboring earldom, a woman of enormous standing in these 3 counties, and the type of mind that finds the contrast between enormous standing and small imagination not merely tolerable but comfortable. She called on a Tuesday with her daughter, and I attended to something in the passage nearby that required my attention precisely during the visit, which is a thing one does when one is curious and has the professional sense not to appear so. The call was cordial on its surface. Lady Aldwell asked Miss Vane about her family in the particular bright, light tone that means the asking is not about the information, but about what the information will reveal. When she received the answers, a merchant family in Crestholme, a mother deceased, circumstances much reduced, she arranged her face in the expression of a woman who has received approximately what she expected and found it entirely consistent with her expectations. She asked about the planned date of the marriage with an attentiveness that was not warmth. She said, in parting, that she hoped Miss Vane would find Northern society accommodating, in the voice of someone who has decided it will not be accommodating, and is giving advance notice of this decision in a way that cannot be directly cited. After she left, I went to the library. Miss Vane was at the reading table with a book open in front of her that she was not reading. She looked up when I came in. Her expression was what it usually was, composed, clear, organized, but there was something behind it, something contained and carefully held. Not distress, exactly. More precisely, the feeling of a person who has been treated as less than they are and has chosen not to react in the moment, and who now needs a private moment to simply absorb it before continuing. Mr. Hadley, she said. Miss Vane, I said, I came to ask whether you'd want a fire in here. It's turned colder this afternoon. She looked at me for a moment, then something in her expression changed just slightly, just enough. Yes, she said. That would be kind. I built the fire myself, though it was not my usual task, and I did it deliberately and without hurrying. When it was going properly, I said, without looking at her directly, Lady Aldwell is a woman of considerable standing in the county and very limited powers of perception, miss. In my experience, the two travel together more frequently than either would admit. A brief pause, then very quietly, Thank you, Mr. Hadley. I left her to her book and her fire. I did not tell her as I left what I had seen when I passed through the entrance hall after the Countess's departure. The Duke had been in the hall. He had not been in the hall when the Countess arrived. I am certain of this, because I had been moving through that corridor and would have seen him. Which meant he had come in through the library passage and had heard the end of the call, or some portion of it, or had received a report of it quickly enough to catch it. He was standing near the door with the expression I had come to associate with a particular internal state, not hot anger, which is visible and quick, but the cold version, which moves through channels and arrives at its destination without announcing its journey. The following week, Lady Aldwell's December entertainment list, from which Miss Vane's name had notably been absent in the first round of cards sent to Northborough, was revised. A new card arrived, correctly addressed to Miss Vane, in the pleasant and perfectly calibrated handwriting of someone who has decided to be pleased by an arrangement they previously declined to make. The Duke had ridden over to Aldwell during those days for a visit of 1 hour, and had returned without speaking of it, and the card arrived 2 days after that. I connected these facts. I said nothing to Miss Vane, because she did not need to know it had required intervention, and because the Duke, characteristically, had made it happen in a way that required no one to feel managed. This is the architecture of those 6 weeks. A transaction proceeding toward a legal conclusion, yes. But underneath it, 2 people arriving from necessity at something neither had intended, and finding it more useful, and then more necessary, and then more irreplaceable than the transaction had promised to be. The Duke had spent 11 years since his father's death, and since a previous understanding that had come to nothing, living with great efficiency and very little warmth. Miss Vane had spent years at the helm of a declining household, managing what could be managed and releasing what could not, having put aside long ago any expectation of being chosen for any reason other than utility. What they found in each other across 4 days on a hard road and 6 weeks in a large house was the specific comfort of being known accurately, not admired from a distance, not managed, not told what they were, simply observed clearly by someone with clear eyes and no particular motive for pretense. I watched it change them the way you watch a fire change a room. You cannot point to the exact moment it becomes warmer, only to the moment you realize it has been for some time. There was an evening in early December when I came into the library to leave a dispatch and found them both there, not together exactly, not occupying the same part of the room, but in the same room, he at the writing table and she in the chair by the fire. Neither of them looked up when I came in. This is a small thing, and I want you to understand why it mattered. People do not fail to look up at an entering person unless that person's entrance is not a disruption to their sense of where they are. I was not a disruption because the room was not in a state of performance. They were simply there, occupied, comfortable in the cohabitation of the space. I set down the dispatch. I withdrew. And as I was closing the door, I heard Miss Vane say something, a comment on what she was reading, I think, or a question. I couldn't quite catch it, and I heard the Duke answer, and then I heard a sound that stopped me for a moment in the passage. The Duke laughing, not performing a laugh, not producing the social sound that sits in the throat and doesn't reach anything. Laughing, the private, unmanaged kind, the kind that a person produces when they have been genuinely caught by something and haven't thought to contain it. It was brief. It was real. I stood in the dark passage for a moment. Then I continued about my duties. The formal signing of the marriage contract was scheduled for the 18th of December. Everything was in order. The solicitors had communicated. The settlement terms were confirmed. Miss Vane's father had signed his portion of the agreement in Crestholme, and the document had arrived by courier the previous week. All that remained was the Duke's signature and hers, and the engagement would be legally binding, and the wedding date would follow in January, well within the February deadline. On the evening of the 17th of December, it snowed. Not a tentative snow, the kind the northern country reserves for when it has decided to commit deep and steady and purposeful, falling straight down in the particular windless silence that means it intends to stay. By 6, the yard was under 6 inches. By 9, the stable lanterns were barely visible from the kitchen door. By 10, the road south was impassable and the road north was questionable, and Northborough Hall was what it sometimes becomes in deep winter, which is its own country, separate from everywhere else. I was checking the horses one last time before the night, my own routine. A thing I do every evening regardless of weather, because horses don't care about the weather, and I've learned not to either when I saw Miss Vane. She was standing in the yard, in her winter coat and her plain boots, standing in the snow that was still falling around her, not going anywhere, not doing anything purposeful, just standing with her face turned slightly upward at an angle between the sky and the middle distance, and the snow falling on her coat and her hair without her apparently minding. She was not in distress. She was not particularly pensive, or not in a way that looked like worry. She looked like a person who had stepped outside because she needed the particular quality of outside. The cold, the openness, the sky above even though it was invisible behind cloud, the fact of being in a space without walls. I almost spoke. I decided against it. She was not in danger, and she had not asked for company, and she had the look of someone taking something she needed. I went back into the stable. I heard about what happened next from Mrs. Brand, who told me in the morning in the quiet and particular way she has of telling me things that have moved her, which is that she tells them flatly and without embellishment, and in a tone of voice that does all the work the embellishment would have done. He went out without his coat, she said, in his shirt sleeves, Mr. Hadley, into the yard in December. I said nothing to encourage her, because she does not need encouragement when she has something to say. He walked across to her, she said, and they spoke, she listened, and then she paused. Mrs. Brand does not pause, she is not a woman given to pauses. When she paused, I gave her my full attention. He went down on one knee, she said, there in the snow, in the yard, in his shirt sleeves. And then, I said. She stood very still for a moment, said Mrs. Brand, and then she held out her hand. And he took it, I said. And he stood up, she said, and they went inside. I nodded. That's all, she said, in the tone of someone who has said everything. That is quite sufficient, I said. I was not there. I am telling you what was told to me, and I am telling you the man I knew across 11 years, and I am asking you to trust the reconstruction, because I did know him well enough to reconstruct it accurately. He told me what he had said in the morning in the stable, while I was checking the near side shoe. He came in early in his greatcoat, not for any reason that involved horses, and he stood for a moment, and then he said, not quite to me, not quite to the air, in the middle distance between us. I told her I would not have her sign the contract under the terms we had agreed to. That I would find another way to manage the entailment, sell the eastern farms, renegotiate with the collateral branch, find a path. I told her she owed me nothing. That the debt had been her father's and the terms his, and that I would not hold her to them. I went on with the shoe. She said, he continued after a moment, that she was not signing under compulsion. He was very still. That she had been watching me for 6 weeks and she thought I was a man worth knowing, and that she had not expected to be able to say that, but she could, and so she would sign it, and she would mean it. He stopped. She said she would mean it. I set down the hoof and looked at him. She is an accurate woman, Your Grace, I said. In 6 weeks I have not once heard her say a thing she didn't. He looked at me. His face was, there is no precise word for what his face was in that moment, so I will try several and you will get the shape of it from the aggregate. Unguarded, young in some specific way. The face of a man who has been carrying something at weight for a long time and has just been, very quietly, relieved of it. He nodded once. Then he went back inside. They signed the contract that morning, the solicitor present, the papers laid on the drawing-room table in good order. She signed first, and her signature was what her handwriting always was, clear, deliberate, nothing wasted. He signed after, and when he set the pen down he said, quietly, not to the solicitor, "That is the last thing we do for the entailment." And she looked at him and said, "Yes. From here it is different," and it was. I drove them to the church 6 weeks later. A clear January morning, the snow eased, the moor white and still and brilliant in the early light, the beach drive with a thin, bright crust of ice that crackled cleanly under the horses' hooves. The church was small. The Duke had not wanted ceremony for its own sake, and she had certainly not wanted it, and the people in it were the household, the 4 adjacent families, the Northborough tenants who had heard and come. Lady Aldwell attended and conducted herself appropriately, which is to say she had observed the direction of things, and was too sensible a woman to be on the wrong side of them. Miss Vane, her Grace, from that morning forward, wore a cream dress that was not new but had been let out at the seams and altered beautifully by someone with skill, because she was the sort of woman who tends to what she has rather than acquiring things for show. She carried nothing, no flowers, no prayer book, nothing. She walked into the church without fidgeting and stood at the Duke's side and was entirely simply herself, not performing composure, simply having it. The Duke looked at her through the whole of the ceremony in a way that I will not describe in full, because it was private. I will only say that it was the look of a man who has been cold for a long time, not by choice, not by nature, but by circumstance and loss and the particular armor people build when things they have cared about have been taken from them, and who is discovering, with something that is not quite surprise but is its near neighbor, that warmth has arrived at last. And has arrived in the form of a woman with gray eyes and a worn leather trunk and a habit of reading the drainage patterns of coaching in yards from cold carriage windows. There was a wedding breakfast at Northborough after modest and warm and very good, because Mrs. Brand's kitchen does not produce anything that is not very good. And I stood in the doorway for a portion of it in my capacity as steward and also, if I am honest, in my private capacity as someone who had driven the road and watched the inn and seen the yard in the snow and wanted to see how the ending looked. It looked like this. Miss Vane, her Grace, was talking to my nephew Thomas, who is 12 and had attached himself to her orbit 3 weeks earlier because she had given him a real answer to a question about river drainage that his schoolmaster had been unable to provide and had simply stopped engaging with. She was talking to him with the same attention she had given the tutor's boy at the inn and the kitchen girl in the linen cupboard and the coal account in the ledger. The attention of someone for whom things that are worth doing fully, without fraction. The Duke was across the room talking to the Northborough head farmer, and he glanced up, and he found her across the room the way you find something you have been tracking at the edge of your awareness. Not a search, not an effort, just the eye going where it goes, and he found her, and he didn't look away for a moment that was one moment longer than looking away would have been. I thought of that yard in December, him in his shirt sleeves, her face turned slightly up. I thought of that letter of receipt in the solicitor's file, 4 pages of terms and provisions describing a girl offered as the resolution of her father's ruin, delivered north in a carriage with 1 trunk and no consultation and a letter she had not written. And I thought that letter described a transaction. What I was watching across the room at that wedding breakfast in that northern house on that January morning, that was something else. That was 2 people who had arrived at each other by a road neither chose, and who had found each other at the end of it, and who would not have found each other any other way, and who both knew it. I have retired now, as I said at the start. 7 years of driving after that winter, and then the knees made their opinion known, and the Duke gave me the cottage on the East Farm, which has a view of the northern moor on clear days, and a very good chimney, and more quiet than I have ever known in my life, and I find I do not mind the quiet at all. On clear days I stand at the window and look at the moor, the same moor we came across in that cracked-wheel November, the same light, the same bracken and rock and sky, and I think about the road. I think about the wheel cracking on the frozen track, and the snow coming in from the west, and Mrs. Fellowes in, and the tutor's boy and his cup, and the fire in the common room, and the Duke standing in the doorway saying good night for the first time. I think about the drainage of the inn yard, and the way she read it from a cold window, and the Latin text, and what she said about duty and resignation being too often confused. I think about the coal account, and the linen cupboard, and the western moorland track in the clear morning, and the way the Duke laughed in the library when he thought no one was listening. I think about the yard in December, and the snow and the shirt sleeves and 1 knee on the ground. I think it was a hard road, and nobody on it had asked to be there, and it turned out to be the only road in the county that led to something worth arriving at. That is what I think when I stand at the window. That is all I think, and it is enough. But perhaps I should tell it more completely, because the outline I have given you is true, and yet an outline leaves out the texture, and it is the texture that convinces. Let me go back to the inn, and to the 3rd morning before we left, because there is a thing that happened then that I have not yet told you, and that belongs in the telling. Mrs. Fellowes had a sister. The sister lived 3 miles farther up the road in a farmhouse that was, as Mrs. Fellowes told me while I was doing the final wheel checks, in some difficulty. Her husband had been ill since September with a lung complaint, and the sister had been managing the farm alone since then, which in the northern country in November means managing it in conditions that a full pair of hands would find demanding. Mrs. Fellowes asked me, when I told her we would be leaving that morning, whether I would stop when we passed the farmhouse and have the carriage leave a box of provisions she had been trying to get to her sister for a week. I said yes, it was no difficulty. What I did not anticipate was Miss Vane, who had been in the passage when Mrs. Fellows explained this and had heard it, asking Mrs. Fellows very quietly whether she knew anything particular about the husband's illness. And when Mrs. Fellows said it was a lung complaint, had been bad since September, the doctor came from the market town when he could, but the roads. Miss Vane nodded and went upstairs, and came back down 10 minutes later with a small paper of dried herbs from her own travel case, and a set of instructions written on a piece of paper in her clear, economical hand. "My mother had a lung complaint in her last years," she said to Mrs. Fellows. "These helped. I don't know whether they'll help your sister's husband. Constitutions differ, but they will not harm, and the directions are written out clearly. If your sister has questions, tell her to write to me at Northborough and I'll answer." Mrs. Fellows looked at her for a moment, then she said, "Thank you, miss." "That is very kind of you." Miss Vane said it was nothing and went to find her trunk. The Duke had been in the stable yard when this happened. He came in for breakfast as Miss Vane was going upstairs, and he came through the passage where I was standing, and I saw on his face, briefly, privately, before he composed it back to its usual arrangement, an expression I can only describe as a man seeing something and realizing, with something close to disquiet, that it has mattered to him considerably more than he was prepared for. He sat down to breakfast and said little. She came down and sat across from him and ate sensibly and said a few words about the road ahead. He answered her. The exchange was what it had been all week, careful, gradually easier, two people finding their way toward naturalness without quite arriving yet. But when we loaded the carriage and I reached the door to hand her up, the Duke was already there, and he held the door, which was not his habit and was in fact my job, and he looked briefly surprised at himself for having done it, and then continued to the horse. We stopped at the farmhouse 3 miles on. A woman came to the door, tired-faced, capable-looking, the kind of person who has been managing alone long enough that they have stopped expecting help and have organized themselves around its absence. When I gave her the box and the herbs and Miss Vane's paper of instructions, the woman looked at me and then looked at the carriage, where Miss Vane was not visible behind the glass. The woman pressed her lips together. She nodded. It was the nod of someone to whom a small kindness has arrived at a moment when they had forgotten small kindnesses were possible. We continued north. That evening at the end of the 4th day, the house came into view against the winter sky, lit from inside, gray and massive and magnificent in the way it always is, and I heard Miss Vane's sharp intake of breath, not alarm, not apprehension, but the involuntary response of someone encountering something that exceeds their estimate of it. The beaches black and bare against the gray-pink sky. The long drive. The light in the windows. The Duke was waiting on the steps. He watched the carriage come up the drive. He watched me help her down. He watched her look up at the house. And I will tell you the precise thing I noticed in those first moments because I was watching him while she was watching the house. For 2 seconds, his face was entirely unguarded. He was watching her take in Northborough for the first time with an attention that had nothing professional in it and nothing transactional. That was simply the face of a man who is watching someone he finds himself interested in encounter something he loves, and who is discovering, in this moment, that those two things together produce something he was not expecting. She turned. He had already composed himself back. She said, "Your Grace," he said, "Miss Vane," and Mrs. Brand came forward and the business of arriving began. The estate's 6 weeks had their texture, and I want to give it to you properly, because it was in the texture that the real thing happened, not in any single event but in the accumulation of ordinary days, each one adding a small fraction of ease and understanding that the day before had not quite managed. The Duke had worked late for 8 years. Not ostentatiously, he did not like display, but his library light was reliably the last lit in the house when I made my evening round of the ground floor windows. In the first week of Miss Vane's arrival, it was still late every night. In the second week, 2 evenings ended before 11. In the third week, 4. By the 4th week, the library was regularly dark before 10, and once or twice before 9. I drew the conclusion that was there. A man who has buried himself in work for 8 years sometimes stops, because the house he is working in has become, without his having planned it, a place he would rather be present in than absent from. Miss Vane organized her days with the tidiness of someone who believes that a well-arranged day is a form of respect for the time inside it. She was up early. She walked when the weather allowed. She spent mornings on the household and afternoons on her reading and correspondence. Letters to the kitchen girl in Cresthome. Occasional letters to her father that she wrote in less time and with a different quality of attention, and other correspondence whose recipients I never established. She issued instructions to the staff only with reasons attached. "Because they will do it better if they know why," she said once to Mrs. Brand, who told me about it in the tone of someone who has been confirmed in a long-held opinion. There was an afternoon in the 5th week when I came across them in the kitchen garden. The gardener had a question about the spring layout, and Miss Vane had walked out to look at a section of ground that had been waterlogged in autumn. The Duke had come around the side of the house for a reason I never established and had found them there. I was near enough to hear. The gardener was saying the south corner had always been difficult, a low point in the drainage. Nothing planted there survived the autumn wet. Miss Vane was looking at the corner with her usual quality of direct attention. She said, "If you dug a gravel channel along the south wall and ran it to the existing drain at the east end, the water would have somewhere to go. It wants digging, but the materials are not expensive." The gardener said he had thought of something like that and wondered whether it would answer. She said, "Try the left-hand quarter of that corner first, over the winter, and see what the soil does before committing to the whole." The Duke had been standing to the side, listening. When the gardener went off, the Duke said, to no one exactly, "You know about drainage." She turned. "I managed our household accounts from the time I was 16. The yard had a problem we could not afford to have professionally addressed, so I worked it out from a book. You learn what you need to learn." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The North Farm's lower field has been waterlogged for 3 seasons. I've had 2 different engineers and neither assessment has satisfied me." "I would be glad to look at it," she said, "if you thought it useful." "Wednesday," he said. "If the weather holds." The weather held. They walked the lower field together. The drainage solution she proposed was simpler and cheaper than either engineer's plan and worked better than both. The head farmer told me so the following summer, with a directness I appreciated. By the beginning of December, the house had a different sound to it. There were small sounds of someone coming in from a walk and speaking to whoever was nearest, of a question called from one room and answered from another, of 2 sets of footsteps on the main stair at different hours, and the particular quality of a house that is being inhabited rather than endured. Mrs. Brand told me it was like a house that had remembered what it was for. I did not tell her she was being sentimental, because she was entirely correct. By the evening of the 17th, when the snow came properly and Miss Vane went out to stand in it, she was not standing there as a stranger. She was standing there as someone who had come to belong to the North Farm and the Western Track and the kitchen garden and the library fire, who had come to belong, though she would not yet have used the word, to Northborough. And she was standing there taking stock of herself and her situation, in the way that people on the eve of an irreversible step take stock. The Duke went out in his shirt sleeves. That is what I keep coming back to when I think of it, not the contract or the entailment or the terms of Mr. Vane's debt, the shirt sleeves, the snow. One knee on the ground, the specific recklessness of a man who is cold in December and does not care because there is something more important than the cold, and he has finally recognized what it is. And the woman in the yard, who had arrived with nothing promised and nothing expected, holding out her hand. Because she had watched him for 6 weeks, because she had assessed him with the same direct, economical attention she brought to drainage patterns and linen cupboards and the balance of supper cups, and she had reached her conclusion. This was a man worth choosing, and she chose him, clearly and precisely and without theater. She was right. She was, in my experience, always right. I stand at the window of my cottage, and the moor is the moor, and the sky is the pewter of coming snow, and I think about the road. The cracked wheel and the blizzard and the inn and the good night and the accumulated ordinary days and the yard in December. 2 people who did not choose the road, who chose each other at the end of it, as clearly as anything I have ever seen chosen in 11 years of watching that man move through the world. It was enough. It was more than enough. It still is. Let me say one more thing about the days in between, the days between the kitchen garden and the December snow. Because I have given you the events, and what I want to give you is the feeling of those days, which is a different thing and harder to describe precisely. A large northern house in late November has a particular quality to it. The light comes in low and gray through the high windows and lies on the floors in long pale patches that move through the afternoon hours and are gone by 3. The fires burn steadily because the old stone walls lose heat slowly, but they do lose it, and the smell of the fires is in everything, the curtains, the books, the wool of coats left too near the hearth. Outside, the moor has gone to its winter configuration. Heather silver-brown and pressed flat, the rock outcroppings stark against the pale sky, the track visible from the upper windows as a darker line threading through the white. Miss Vane walked that track nearly every morning that the weather allowed, and I took note of when she did and when she did not, because the weather that prevented the walk also tended to bring her early to the library, where the fire was best. And on those mornings the Duke was also likely to have left the breakfast table later than usual, which is the kind of coincidence that stops being a coincidence after it has occurred 4 or 5 times. I watched them find, across those weeks, a vocabulary for each other. Not the vocabulary of affection, not yet, and not quite. The vocabulary of 2 people who have discovered that they do not need to perform anything in each other's presence, and who find this fact simultaneously relieving, and I think this is the right word, disorienting. They had both been performing in their different ways for a long time. He performing the cold Duke, because being the cold Duke was efficient and required less of him than the alternative. She performing the adequate, capable, manageable daughter, because being those things was safe and required nothing she was not willing to give. In each other's presence, in the privacy of a house that was slowly becoming their shared life, neither of those performances was necessary or even particularly possible. She saw through the cold Duke in the first week, not with drama, not with any announcement, simply with the steady-eyed perception of a woman who reads drainage patterns from moving carriages and notices coal account discrepancies in an afternoon. And he saw, behind the capable and undemanding exterior she presented to the world, something that the world had not troubled to look for, a person of genuine depth and genuine hunger for the life she had been managing rather than living. There was a Sunday afternoon, I am almost certain it was a Sunday, because the kitchen was quiet and the house had its Sunday quality of reduced motion, when I passed the drawing room and heard her at the pianoforte. She played well. Not in the manner of a young lady who has been trained to demonstrate accomplishment at the instrument, and therefore plays correctly and without feeling, but in the manner of someone who plays because the music is the thing, because the music is the point, and the technical correctness is merely the vehicle. She was playing something I did not recognize, a melancholy piece in a minor key, slow and considered, the kind of music that does not make a display of its feeling but contains a great deal of it. I stopped in the passage and listened for a moment. The Duke was in the drawing room. He had been there before she sat down, I think, reading in the chair by the window. He sometimes read there in the afternoon when the light was good, and when she sat at the instrument he had not left. I could not see his face from the passage, but I could hear the music stop after a time, and I could hear her say, "I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were still here. I'll stop." And I could hear him say, in a voice that was quieter than his usual voice, "No, please don't." She played for another half-hour. When she finished and the room was quiet again, I heard him say something I couldn't catch, a question, I think, about the piece or the composer. I heard her answer at some length. I heard them talk, in the drawing room in the Sunday afternoon light, about music and what it is for. And by the time I had moved on down the passage toward my own business, the conversation had moved to the subject of what things are for in general, which is the kind of conversation that 2 people have only when they have stopped being careful with each other and have started being real. I noted this too. I added it to the account. There was also the matter of the letters. I do not mean to suggest I read Miss Vane's correspondence. I would not, and I did not. But I carried the outgoing post, and I carried the incoming, and the names on the envelopes told me what I needed to know without my needing to know more. In the 3rd week, a letter came from Crestholme addressed in a hand I did not recognize, not Mr. Vane's, which I had seen on the settlement documents, and which had the confident, slightly florid quality of a man who had once been prosperous. This hand was smaller and neater. The kitchen girl, I assumed, or someone of that household, writing back. Miss Vane read it at the breakfast table and folded it carefully and kept it. In the 4th week, 2 letters went out from her hand, both addressed in Crestholme and neither to her father. She was maintaining a life in those small rectangles of paper, a life that was behind her, and that she was not cutting off from but was continuing in a different form, the way careful people continue things rather than abandoning them. The Duke received a letter from a London solicitor in that same period. I recognized the seal, and read it in the library and burned it in the grate, which told me it was not good news in any straightforward sense. I later learned indirectly that it was a communication from the collateral branch of the family, offering to negotiate. The Duke did not negotiate with them. He was attending to the matter in the way he attended to all matters, directly and finally without drawn-out process. The matter would be resolved by a marriage. The marriage was being arranged. That was the end of the negotiation. He burned the letter. He came to midday dinner. He talked to Miss Vane about the North Farm's winter preparation and listened to what she said about it, which was sensible and specific. And by the end of the meal, the conversation had moved so far from the burned letter and the collateral branch and the whole apparatus of the entailment that it might have belonged to a different life entirely. This is what I mean about texture, not the dramatic moments, the wheel, the snow, the yard, the contract, the ordinary days, the library in the evenings, the Sunday pianoforte, the letters sent and received, the midday dinners that were supposed to be formal and gradually were not. The North Farm in the morning light, two people walking a waterlogged field together, looking at the ground and the slope and the line of things, and finding that they saw the same things when they looked. This is what 6 weeks in a house together can do, when the people are honest and the house is real and neither of them is performing. It can make a transaction into a life. It can make a cold stone house in the north of England into the specific place where a specific understanding grew, quietly and without announcement, between two people who had not known they were looking for it. By the evening of the 17th of December, when the snow came and Miss Vane went out to stand in it, she was standing in a place that was hers. She was taking stock of that, I think she was. Of the strangeness of it. Of the fact that she had arrived with a letter of receipt and one small trunk, and had found in the 6 weeks since not what the transaction had promised, a resolution of a debt, a legal conclusion, a correct and managed arrangement, but something she had given up expecting, a place that was genuinely hers, and a man who was genuinely worth being married to. She stood in the snow, and the Duke came out in his shirt sleeves. He told her she was free. He told her he would find another way. He went down on one knee in the Northborough yard in December, in the dark, in the snow, with no society watching and no document waiting, and he gave her back the choice that should have been hers from the beginning. She held out her hand. Not because she had to. Not because the debt remained, or the entailment pressed, or any of the mechanisms that had set this in motion were still operating. She held out her hand because she had watched Dorian Ashcroft, 7th Duke of Northborough, the most feared landowner in 3 counties, move through 6 weeks of ordinary days, the midday dinners and the library evenings and the North Farm and the kitchen garden and the Sunday music. And she had concluded, with all the precision and accuracy that were the bedrock of her character, that this was a man worth having. A man who had been alone in his cold house for 8 years, not because he was cold, but because being warm required a person equal to it, and she was equal to it. She held out her hand. He took it, he stood, they went inside. And that is, finally and properly, the story.